think we can get started. So I figured out how to present your, just present the screen that you're sharing, and we can hear you in the room and see your slides, and we'll also see a thumbnail of your face when you're talking.
Okay, awesome. Thank you
Okay,
so much, Hassan.
yeah, all right, so we can get started. I think most of you probably know, but this is our Data 1050 class. We also have folks from the rest of the Brown community joining potentially as well. So my name is Hassan. I'm one of the professors of practice at the DSI. Today we're really excited to have Annie Fan. Annie is a Brown alum and currently the Chief Data Officer at Lavender. She has experience working at McKinsey and other data science companies in her history. And today she's going to be talking about how to communicate complex data insights, or essentially how to have business impact with data. And so I'm really excited to have her. She's going to have some slides that she's going to walk us through, and then hopefully we'll have time for some questions at the end. So Annie, you can take it away.
Thank you so much, Hassan. It's great to be back at the DSI. I was an undergrad student at Brown, and I did the data science master at Brown as well. But I think DSI was like one of the most special part of my entire journey at Brown. I was hoping to make today's conversation a little bit interactive instead of just me speaking. So I'll pause for questions, comments. So please feel free to interrupt me anytime, raise any questions or any insights that you want to share, as well as put your answer in the chat. So before I get started, I will give a quick introduction of myself. So basically, I study economics and data science at Brown. And after college, joined McKinsey as a business analyst in a digital practice. So I did a lot of data transformation and data architecture build work. And then recently make the pivot to Fanatics, where I work at a business operation associate, mostly focusing on digital transformation project for the different teams in our trading cards department. And I recently joined a startup with one of my friends. Basically, we are a B2B SaaS company that provides order management and store management software for beauty salons. So data science was a really big part of my journey. I did a couple fellowship at Brown and after Brown. Also, I was at Brown, I volunteered as our data fellow for Bluebonnet, where I did kind of data science and analytics for Democratic campaign. And recently, I did the Data Science for All fellowship with Correlation One. I believe they also advertised the program to our like DSI students. So I think it's a really great opportunities if you want to like be a fellow and get connected to different job opportunities. I also started a Hacker Noon channel recently, and I post a few articles on there. I'm hoping to post like more frequently in the next year. So please feel free to follow me at Hacker Noon and read through my articles, and feel free to comment, give me feedback on them. Um, so before I jump into the topic today, something I want to share is I would say that my journey after the DSI is a little bit unconventional compared to the rest of my class. So as you know, the majority of the people who did the Brown Data Science Master, went on to become data scientists or data engineer, like very technical roles. For me, I enter kind of a more hybrid role, and I actually work more in business functions. So my day-to-day role is not a data scientist or a data engineer. However, the topics that I work with are highly technical and highly focused on data science, data architecture, digital transformation. So if you're wondering like why this was the choice that I made, I think it's a couple observations that I made over the years was that I think like something I realized was I'm very passionate about roles that have a hybrid nature because I think in today's world there are so many opportunities and to create value add. If you have a little bit of best of both worlds, what I notice is that there's a gap for instance like in recent year, right? There has been a lot of innovations that happen in the data science and the technological space. But because of these changes, like for instance, like recently we had the whole like Gen AI hype, because of the fast pace of how these things change, there are very limited accurate information. And everyone is honestly like very confused, and I don't think anyone actually has a full comprehensive understanding of how these chains impact our day-to-day job and our industry, right? Like even with Gen AI, like different people have different opinions and different views about it. So it is very important that there's a focus on being able to communicate and send the right messages about these technological innovation so that we can build and scale them in the right way in our workflow, but also like create kind of a more inclusive environment for these kind of dialogue. So something that I noticed when I entered the workforce is that one was digital transformation has become like a really big part of every company's strategic focus in the past few years. And with the rise of like data and AI solutions, um, data transformation is the biggest area in digital transformation. When I was at McKinsey, so like before I joined, McKinsey was more known for their like strategy consulting focus, right? But I would say like in the past 5 or 7 years, the shift has changed massively, and their digital transformation practice has become like the biggest area of work. So basically, when I joined, more than half of the work there was in digital transformation. And within digital transformation, more than 50% of the work was focused on data transformation. So that ranges from helping companies set up like data architecture and data pipeline to hiring data talent and restructuring their data org. Um, and the gap here is that the reality is that in the workforce and the work environment, there's a misalignment between one is the technical level of understanding between the business team and executives versus the tech team. Um, so here are some of the challenges that I've seen when I was working, right? So first, a lot of there are a lot of silos operations happening when it comes to data operations of every company. And I think that stemmed from the fact that innovations in data architecture, like such as data warehouse and ELT or ETL pipeline, didn't come until like the late 2010s, right? And a lot of companies have already have like data gathered before that, and there were just like no industry-wide guidelines or practices around how to house these data. So what happened is there becomes like a lot of silo activities going on across the company. The second thing was the needs for data literacy has really risen in the past year, right? You can see that analytics and AI ML applications is like super important, but even like simpler than that, like basic understanding of statistic and business KPIs is crucial for executive to make data-driven decisions. And data literacy has become like a must-have requirement for anyone entering workforce. But literacy alone isn't enough because teams need to be able to commute these the data into actionable insights so that they can make decisions that actually drive operational output, right? Uh, and the last piece of challenge that I see is that different teams, even in the same company, use the same use different terms and different definition for the same KPIs or data metrics or like analytical exercise, and it creates a lot of discrepancies and inaccuracy in reporting and in analysis that ultimately affects their operational decisions, right? And profit as well. It is very important that there is like a person who played a role of an analytic translator to ensure that one, everyone is on the same page, but two, number is translated into like meaningful actions. I'll pause for a minute and let me know if anyone like shared the same sentiment or if you have any comments on this. Right? I'll keep moving. Uh, so I don't know if you've ever heard of the role of analytic translator, but it's it's kind of I don't think that there's any kind of official job role on the market for analytic translator. It's more of kind of like a job function that you play in the workforce as part of your day-to-day job. And this is a term that a lot of kind of leaders in the industry coined a few years back with the rise in data. So at McKinsey, we actually had like a whole like training done on analytic translation. And I don't know if I would assume everyone here has taken Andre's Data 1030 class, right? And I remember in like one of his class, the last part of the data pipeline was about translating the results of the different models that you build into so what insights for the end audience, right? I think the analytic translator role is basically what that part was covering about. And this has become an increasingly high needs for company. And I just want to say that analytic translator is not a standalone role. So even as a data scientist or a data engineer, you still have to be an analytic translator. Or even if you're in business operation like me, but work with a lot of technical and data teams, that will be the kind of role that you play. The key here is really being the bridge between the tech or data teams and the business team to communicate data insights into actionable business strategy, translates business needs into technical requirements for AI ML model building, and enable data-driven decision based on these results. And the skills for the analytic translator, which I think that our master has done a fantastic job in preparing us for, is the technical knowledge. Where I think that we need to do a little bit of extra work and you work for it is on business acumen. And I think like a lot of the programs in our master also kind of encourage the development of business acumen and a focus on one data domain, right? Like for instance, during the practicum class or even during your final project in every class, it is always encouraged that you pick a certain maybe like industry or segment that you want to deep dive into. I think this is really important because in the business world, you will always, even if you enter as a data scientist or data engineer, you will have a focus on like different kind of data domains or different kind of industry. And the more you know about it and the more you are able to leverage your data science expertise in that area, the further you can travel. And the last thing is interpersonal skills. So this goes beyond just like oh, I'm a good team player, right? I can present well. Um, it is very important to recognize that every technical challenge is a reflection of org challenges as well, right? Um, for instance, like all of the issues that I mentioned before here in this slide, ultimately is a reflection of legacy structure with companies, or gaps, in hiring data talent, and like building data architecture. And undoubtedly, different people at your business would have, again, different views on how they want to leverage AI ML adoption or how they want to design the data architecture of your org. And sometimes you will be part of those conversation. And it is important that you know how to navigate these politics to make sure that your work gets the recognition that it deserves, but also the impact that it can make on the company. Let me know if it makes sense or if there's anything people want to jump in onto that. Right. So I don't want to spend too long on this, but again, just want to call out how important it is for analytic translation in the workforce and why having this skill would really make you stand out, not only in the recruiting process, but also in your long-term career, right? Um, I think the main thing that business really need right now is how do they make data-driven decisions, right? Um, and two is how to build scalable AI ML solutions. Like ultimately, any technology and data solutions that is built should be a standalone process, but it should be something that enables operational and financial metrics for the company, right? So you could build like the most complex and accurate model out there, but if you can't really find use cases for it or can translate to, the director of your team on how this will help the bottom line or your um throughput efficiency, it's gonna come to waste. And the other thing I want to call out is data strategy is more and more companies, like in both my job at McKinsey and Fanatics, I've noticed that data strategy is becoming a bigger focus area of every executive. When I say data strategy, what I meant, it has a very broad definition, but it usually means how do we come up with how to use the data that we have to unlock business value? And that could range from how do we like build our data, rebuild our entire data architecture? What are different use cases we can build for AI ML solutions? And how do we hire data talent and create a more data-driven and innovative culture? Um, yeah. And obviously there are different ways that we can build analytic translation. I think like for us, the focus is less on like building a technical understanding because we already have so much of that from the master, right? But I think the what we're really helpful is again expanding that technical knowledge into real world industry domain, right? So whether that means picking an industry that you're passionate about or a corporate function that you think you'll be interested in working in. For instance, for me, a lot of the data I work with tend to be like kind of like product focused data and operational KPIs because I mostly work in strategy and operations. But I personally am also interested in um, kind of sales and marketing data, which is why I joined Lavender, like the B2B SaaS company, right? And I just haven't interacted with as much sales and marketing data at my job at McKinsey. and phonetics. So I'm hopefully trying to find opportunities to expand more of that. Um, yeah, and you see that like like when you join the workforce in the first few years, like yes, you will mostly be judged on your technical abilities and like whether you can do the work well, but after 2 or 3 years, it's time to think about like where do we go from here and how do we really grow our career. I think it's really important to have like the ability to speak both data and business because that's will give you so much more flexibility and ownership of your career trajectory. And then just want to share that this talk is actually inspired by a Hackathon article that I wrote a couple months ago. So if you want to check this out and give me some feedback or comments or share your thoughts, you're welcome to. All right. Before I jump into an actual case that I've worked on and how I approach analytic translation in this context. Does anyone have anything they would like to share? Or do you have any questions?
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I think someone has a question, but I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Yeah, I think it might be hard for you to hear the room, but I'll pass the mic around if anyone has questions. I wanted to ask one thing, which is one of the questions that I get very frequently is how, I think a lot of people understand the value of the building out this like skill set of being able to understand business and being able to bridge data and business. But the challenge often is like, how do you build that skill set when you're
Yeah,
still in school? And so
yeah.
I'm kind of curious if you have any thoughts about like, any advice for people who are, taking courses and like, kind of currently pursuing their masters,
Yeah.
like how you would build a skill set like this.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Asan. That was the same like like struggle that I had when I was still in school. I think the biggest challenge here is because when we're in school, we don't really have kind of interaction with real world data, right? So there are a couple ways that I go about it. So I would say like as young people, we're always consuming media, right? We're always on Instagram, like TikTok, YouTube, whatever. I find something very helpful that to follow, like to pick like a certain maybe industry or real world topic that you like and follow them on social media and like increase your domain knowledge about it just by reading about it. I think a lot of people think of like, oh, like building industry knowledge as you have to read like long research paper or really complicated articles. If that's what you like totally do it. But I personally feel like, for instance, like me, like a lot of time I'm just doom scrolling on Instagram, like when I'm on a train or whatever. And I find that like I would kind of, follow like there's a lot of LinkedIn influencer, that talk about like AI ML topics, or for instance, like I'm very interested in GTM, like AI and GTM topics lately. So I follow a bunch of uh VP of sales at different Series A and Series B startup that focus on AI, right? And they would make a lot of posts, and that's how I gain more knowledge about GTM, right? Or like I also follow a lot of news channel on like Instagram and TikTok, and I would pick like I'm very interested in consumer and tech media industry, so I would like read about it like, oh, Netflix just rolled out like new AI capabilities, or like I came across an article on how actually like Gen AI could transform the interface of Netflix. Like each user can actually build our own kind of interactive, kind of customized interface thanks to AI, right? So it's just little things like that that I think helps. The other thing is obviously go out of your comfort zone and find as many opportunities to have real work experience as possible. I think like Brown Practicum like is a great way to do that, but also like there are opportunities even during the semester where you can do this, right? Whether like for instance, for me, I volunteer with Blue Bonnet, and even though like political and campaign data is not my domain focus, I felt like I learned a lot during that experience because I work with like first of all, I get to work with the kind of real world data that I just never seen before, and it's like vastly different from business data. And two is the kind of insights that can you imagine like the work I was doing, like you kind of have to communicate like machine learning results into what the candidate should be doing for their campaign so they can get more votes, or like what kind of message should they be sending in their campaign to get more rally for it. So Brown has a lot of research assistant opportunities, like especially with our like a different school that we have, like with the biochem department, public health, even public policy. There's like I think you can also reach out to like even people like Lindar and Andrus, right? They have a lot of industry connection, and there are a lot of opportunities that you can find. It's really important to work with real world data and work in like a real world setting so you can see where the gaps in your skill are and grow. And the last thing is obviously leverage your personal network, right? Like talk to your friends who are already working, or talk to your friends at different school, or like you're just connecting with people on LinkedIn. I honestly find that like people are very open to other people reaching out as long as you have a clear idea of what is it that you need to them. Like if you're looking for um opportunities to, apply your skills in a certain domain area, like don't be afraid to ask, like post on LinkedIn. I post on LinkedIn all the time about like what I need, or I would just ask my friends and they would share it with their other friends. Let me know if that was helpful. All right. So I would like to spend the rest of our session on an actual example of how I play an analytic translator role in one of my day-to-day job. So I'll give you a little bit of background. So I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with Fanatics, but if you're a sports fan, I think you've heard of us. Basically, we have four divisions. Fanatics Commerce makes sports merch, and Fanatics Betting and Gaming is focused on wild sports betting and gaming. I am in the collectible division where we make trading cards of your different favorite sports team. And trading card is a very interesting and niche business because there are like very few trading cards company on the market, and the process is like really, really focused on the collector experience. So the way a trading card is made and priced and sold is so meticulous. And like it's not something that you can easily find somewhere. And I think what's interesting about Fanatics was Fanatics Collectible especially, is we are actually quite a new organization. So a lot of our data and tech capabilities are very emerging. So when I joined, like my job in the past couple of months has really been focused on like how to ensure that tech and data is built in the right way for business use. Um, and there's a million of challenges that I have to navigate, right? From the fact that we don't have data governance in place and we're trying to build that out, to the fact that like there are different expectations and silo operation. And it's been like a very interesting journey. So and also like just want to flag for, like obviously IP purposes, I have to grade out some of the data and insights here, just like to ensure that protecting companies' IP. Uh, Also, like the focus on this will be more on how to communicate the results of the analysis to an executive and business audience who don't have a lot of technical knowledge. So I won't be spending time on, how did I do this analysis? So basically, the exercise that I had to do here was so at Fanatics, our most popular and biggest license is baseball. And Top Scroll Baseball is kind of our flagship product. And like there was a time where we had to come up with kind of how to price the 2023 Top Scroll Baseball data Top Scroll Baseball product based on previous year's data. The challenge here was that the information we get to analyze is not perfect. There's a lot of missing information, and I don't mean just by the data has some like NAs or like null value. It's literally that we don't have retail price data and we only have secondary market data. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with the trading cards business, but the way it works is um, the card manufacturer or producer, which is Fanatics, we make and produce the cards and we sell it to different channels, right? One channel is obviously our Fanatics e-commerce website, but then hobby breakers and other retailers are really big part of our value chains because that's where the consumer go to uh, get the cards, right? And the way the hobby breaker works, I don't want to go too much into it, but basically we ship different boxes to them and then um, they buy it and mix up the cards and then they have different people signing up for the different pack inside the different products without knowing which player they are buying. They just know that it's that team and that's their favorite team, their session and the season and that and the excitement is in the not knowing part of which player they're getting, right? Because of this, it makes the pricing data for this kind of market like very interesting because it's very inconsistent. And we kind of collect it from many different sources. There's also a lot of fluctuations. There's no like clear, it's kind of not like when you go to uh like Target and you're trying to buy like a toothbrush. Like it's there's a lot of random fluctuations based on sports season, like based on baseball season, but also it could also just be based on, maybe a player like blow up for some reason, right? Like Shohei Ohtani like really blow up in the past few years, and then his cards would be like priced way more than someone else. Um, so the given all this challenge, we had to come up with a pricing strategy and then recommend it to our sales and marketing team. Uh, and the decision that we decided to go with was after a lot of analytics done, we actually realized that the price that we can sell to the different hobby breaker channel will actually be a function of a retail price in the past year, but then there will be proxy building into the retail price and that is based on a predictive function of what 2023 retail price would look like based on 2021 and 2022 data. And then apart from that, we have to done a lot of qualitative insights and discovery to come up with an optimized pricing strategy. So like I said, given the meticulous nature of our business, it's not enough to just like dump a dashboard that we built for the sales team and be like, hey, go price the product however you want, right? Like we actually have to work really closely with them to say like, hey, like using your knowledge about the seasonality of baseball products, and all the changes that happening with MLBs. Here are how the pricing strategy can be customized across different season. Um, yep, and this is the final recommendation that we give. So So I would like to focus here not on what is it that I find, but more on what are some different ways that you can present the data that you communicate to a business user, right? So I would say that something that business user really care about is so what, right? Like what is your data telling me? What does it mean for my business? So and at McKinsey we were usually taught with you should always lead with the answer, right? So I know this can sound a bit like kind of counterintuitive because usually like for us as data scientists, we go through the approach and then we validate, the results many times, and then we come up with the answer, right? And then the way we present it is like, oh, this is like the problem is our approach, this is our answer. Now, when you present to a business user, you kind of have to do the opposite, where you open with, hey, this is the answer that I have for your business based on what I did. And that's just why it's very important, like whether you're giving a presentation or maybe you're sitting in a meeting, that you lead with what is the so what, right? Like so for instance here, the actionable insights that I came up with was when I analyzed 2021, 22 data, there's opportunities to adjust product volume based on demand to maximize the potential selling price. I think like this is the key that I want the sales team to take away. And then you can give a little bit of deep dive into what does it mean? Like what does this answer mean for a different parts of the strategy? Like again, it's more important that we focus on the so what here instead of what what is just happening, right? Like so like for instance, like on these data, is this crucial to summarize to them like on a high level, here are the key observation that I want you to focus on. And based on that observation, here's what it means for you and what I think you can do. I also really like breaking things into buckets. Like for instance, within a pricing strategy, I think quantity is also a really important component because like quantity and price, they're kind of like they influence each other, right? So you can't be like, yeah, I will price a product a certain way without consideration of, well, how many of them are you releasing on the market? Do you have any questions there before I jump to the next method? Yes. So the first takeaway was lead with the answer, right? And focusing on the so what and the actionable insight for the business. The second takeaway that I would like to share when you talk to the business audience is that what are some practical insights that you can back up in your methodology to the end user? And you want to make these insights very real and relevant for the business. So for instance, it is not enough to, oh, I see a question from Mice. I will answer in a minute. So what I meant is it's not enough to just be like, oh yeah, like you should price your price should be based on volume like volume sold and the market data, right? Like that's it is the recommendation that I give, but it's the general. When you talk to the business team, you want to point to very specific evidence relevant to the function. For instance, right? In my analysis, I noticed that in 2021, the price of our baseline product just kind of skyrocketed. And the reason for that was because there's a huge collector boom from the COVID from the COVID-19 pandemic. And then MLB season just returned, right? And there's the debuts of a lot of baseball rookies and athletes. And these are all things that our sales team has to kind of be in touch with, like, by the way, but like it's important to make it real and relevant for them, right? And another insight that I would like to share on how to be a really good analytic translator is the way that you structure your answer, or uh so there are different ways that you can do it. If you've noticed, like through verbal communication, I do this a lot where I say, this is what I want to share, and then and there are 3 points I'm sharing, number one, number two, number three. I think that's something that I've been taught at McKinsey. Getting into my consultant mode is always keep your communication top down and very structured. Lead with the so what and go with the backup. Now, when you put it on a presentation or a written report, or even an email, there are different kind of written format you can play around with to make communication easier, right? For instance, everything I put here technically can be communicated in like a paragraph, right? But it's gonna be very hard for, imagine like the director of sales. Like if you give this to them in like a long paragraph, they're gonna get lost and they're just not gonna read it. One like comment I usually get is people like they prefer things that are kind of visually appealing to them. So you like using structure like tables or diagrams, like, and even just simple ones, where possible, would make your communication a lot like more effective. Um, I would say that there are different, if you need kind of inspiration on what kind of frameworks or format you can use to communicate a message, there are I would say, like, as a consultant, we get trained on a lot of different kind of framework that we can use. For data scientists, there might be less resources of that, but I think like you can always try Googling stuff like business communication framework, right? Or like, even if you're really stuck, it doesn't hurt to throw your answer into ChatGPT and be like, hey, like, can you brainstorm me a few ways to communicate it in a more like digestible, like, should I use a table to communicate this? Is there a diagram I can draw with this, right? Um, right. Um, and then the fourth insight that I want to share is in the structure of the communication. So I'm not sure if you've noticed, and I will go back a little bit to my agenda before, is I've broken down how I'm going to communicate my results into 4 buckets that have a chronological order to it, right? Like I will start with the background information and the historical analysis that I did, then go into 2023 prediction, and then approach for beyond 2023. And then within each of these categories, I further break it down into smaller sections where, for instance, this section I focus on just like overall product volume and price. And this I started focusing on retail's price trends. And then this I focus on the seasonality nature of the price. And this is the parts where I also kind of brought back in the strategic recommendations that my team came up with for a sales and marketing team, apart from just the pricing insights, right? I think it's another important thing to keep in mind is that a number doesn't mean anything if it's not contextualized in the right business context and the right application. Well, and then the last part I talk about is quantity sold. Like even though this go back to the point I said earlier that even though the analysis that I was asked to do is not a pricing strategy, based on my work experience and based on the analysis that I do, it is impossible to talk about price without talking about the volume that you are releasing or the volume that is available on the market. So I've took a liberty to go like a little above and beyond and also done an analysis on the volume. And come up with what does it mean for your business and what kind of volume strategy, like how should you release the quantity that you're producing, right? Cool. Yes, and this is where we step into the final recommendation for 2023. I like to use a lot of table structure, and a little trick that I did here, if you see, is earlier I said that there's seasonality to the price of base oil products, and based on my analysis and observation, here are 4 different phase of pricing that I've observed from the different graphs, right? So I came up with these phrases using the data, and the characteristics are also observation from the data. And then I tie it back with real business insights on why this could be happening, and then end with what does it mean for the pricing and the quantity strategy. I think this is like something that is very useful is we should, if there are kind of complexity in the answer you're giving, it's helpful to break it into parts or phases and give each parts a kind of characteristic, so that you can communicate it more easily with the end users. Well, and the last part of the analysis that I did was I drew this customized chart based on some kind of fuzzy data that I create for 2023. Like I just create like a simulation and I was like, hey, like this is what I think 2023 trends will look like, right? And again, this go back to the point of people like visualizations more than words. So instead of like trying to say like, oh, the 2023 data will start high and then fluctuate later, I think it's just easier if I can give our sales team like look of this what it will look like. Here are different phases, and here's tactically how you can price it. Something else that is also helpful is if you can take out a little part in your analysis and demonstrate it with real number or real examples, like what I did here, it will be very impactful for the user because they can actually see what does it mean, right? I have to gray out the number here for IP purposes, but hopefully you get it. Cool.
Just a quick comment that we're gonna get kicked out of our classroom soon.
Yeah.
Because we're heading at the hour mark.
Okay. Cool. So I'm actually at the end of my presentation. Do we have 4 minutes left or?
Getting kicked out of the classroom, but I think we can still continue over Zoom, if that's okay?
Okay. Sounds good.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Cool. So we have 3 minutes left. So I would like to answer the question.